Tell us about the paper. What motivated you to write it, and then
Yeah,
further.
yeah, yeah. Um, so, just to give everybody a kind of a brief overview of my motivations for writing the paper. Um, uh, as as many of you know, that Republic Book 10 is a classical text in which Plato criticizes poetry or the poets in general. And the view is not simply that he doesn't just simply say that a bad poetry is bad, uh, which is something he says elsewhere. Like in Republic Books 2 and 3, or in other works, he will say some poetry is good, while other poetry is bad, and he tries to distinguish good from bad poetry. Book 10 seems much more radical. He tries to argue that poetry as such, insofar as it is poetry, is just totally bad. And bad here is meant in all kinds of senses, like metaphysically it's bad because it doesn't present reality. Epistemologically it's bad because it doesn't it distorts the world as we know it. So it doesn't give us a correct access to a reality. And ethically, it's bad because it will tend to portray bad actions as attractive, or unable to portray good actions. Now, Plato's critique of poetry in Book 10 has commonly been understood to be unsuccessful. People think his arguments are not very convincing, and often the arguments seem to be dependent on a metaphysical position that's outdated, namely what we like to say, like Plato's theory of ideas or theory of forms. This notion that there's a kind of a transcendent reality or originals that are beyond the sensible world and beyond sensible experience. And Plato criticizes poetry because poetry is unable to portray these objects in their stories in any attractive way. But if the critique is dependent on an outdated metaphysical worldview, it seems like the critique itself is flawed or outdated. So, one of the things I was trying to do in my paper is actually to, you might say, resurrect or revitalize Plato's critique. I wanted to show that you don't have to assume Plato's theory or the baggage of his philosophical viewpoint, and you can still understand why he thought poetry was worthy of being examined under a critical light, if not, totally attacked. So I didn't want to say like Plato's attack um, was successful, but I did want to say that he deserves a hearing more than the scholars usually assume. There's something to. He's making an interesting point, and I try to be as sympathetic as I can uh, uh, to that point, and make it come to light uh, in my paper. So that was the original motivation for writing the paper that I did write. There are so many ways to write about Plato's engagement with poetry, but eventually I adopted this viewpoint where I try to show that uh, even if Plato wasn't successful, he was it's much less of a failure than people usually give him credit for. One of the crucial things that was very important in my paper is uh, Plato's idea that the good life or the good person is always a stable person. This seems to be a fundamental thought driving Plato's discussion. So I think he's relying on a kind of assumption or intuition we all have. Like we call a person a good person, or we deem someone worthy of emulating or imitating if they show a kind of a constant or stable character. So, like when bad things happen or when challenging situations happen, this person sticks with the values that he or she claims he always is loyal to, or will never let go, or like someone who continues to abide by his or her principles, like telling the truth or being honest, even if it ends up meaning like harming his or her own benefit. So it seems like we have an intuition that the good person is the person who doesn't change color, who doesn't change principles, or who doesn't change values just because the situation changes. Um, and Plato seems to agree with this. Plato seems to think, philosophically speaking, if you want to be a philosopher, you want to live the good life, you should accept this intuition. Like the good person is the person who doesn't change or is stable no matter what happens. And from this point of view, he seems to think that poetry is singularly bad because poetry is the kind of medium that endorses or even approves of change. It is what's fundamentally motivating poetry is to tell stories of change, and these stories of change tend to glorify change, and they don't glorify stability. I don't really make this point in my paper, but I always felt that one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have that supports Plato is that we often find stories about bad people much more interesting, like TV shows or movies, like you don't really want to see like a good person always doing the good things. It looks like a very preachy story, a preachy novel or a preachy movie, and it seems boring. It seems like like a kind of moral propaganda. We like to see morally questionable people, bad people doing uh, 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 things that are, you might say, not so good. And Plato thinks that this is bad in two ways. First, it tends to portray good behavior less. That's already bad. But the second thing is that it actually makes the kind of behavior of bad people attractive. And he thinks that's a kind of a, you might say he argues this in a very exaggerated terms in the Republic. He claims that once you have poetry in a community or in society, people will inevitably have this kind of reversal or values where stability is no longer seen as good, and instability is seen as as good, and then people will have confused or mixed up or messed value systems, and that's not good for the community or the uh, or society. And Plato's uh, attacks, critiques poetry as a kind of part of his effort to really control it. He wants to use the power of poetry to do the things he wants it to do, namely to portray good people and to present, what we would say, uh, uh, or I would argue that Plato wants poetry to write stories that we would usually find boring, that we wouldn't usually enjoy or take pleasure in. So that was kind of like what I did with my paper. Um, if it's okay, I kind of want to just like use this as an occasion to move on to the wonderful question catalog that Karim sent me beforehand. I was reading uh, in the metro today. Like, um, is that okay?
That was great.
Okay, okay. Um, so I think like the question catalog is quite nice because it it kind of forces me to like rethink these old issues that I've always found um, that I always found very challenging, and worthy of being revisited. So I'll just go through this in no particular order, just in the order that Karim sent me. Um, there's Mai Osman. Um, so I get the question. I'll just read the question so that all of you know what I'm reading. Um, if everyone is prone to be disturbed and unsettled, this is a point I make actually in my paper. If everyone is prone to be disturbed and unsettled, I don't understand then how is poetry's power to represent change considered a limitation. Could it not be the case that poets understand the nature of life the same way Socrates views it? That life is full of uncertainties, and poets are capable of capturing and representing changes that happen to everyone, including the virtuous characters? This is the question. Um, so I think this is actually quite important. Like, what exactly is Plato's view of life? Like, is it a case that actually Plato and poets view human life in the same way, but they have very different evaluations of it? Or that he even thinks the poet's view of life um, is wrong? Um, and I would actually say Plato's view is kind of like this, if I could put it in this way. He seems to think that the poets are correct or right like 99.9% of the time. Like a good poet, when he tells a good story, he or she is capable of revealing the human condition. This is how people react when they encounter situations like this.
We have to take a quick break for the praise caller for praise.
Oh,
For prayer time.
yes, no problem.
So that we can pray.
I feel very nostalgic for that.
Yeah, just take 2 minutes, okay? Okay. So the event is done. You can maybe trace back the last 2 minutes you were thinking about later perception of life.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Just where we left off, if you could just go back, the last sentence, repeat the last sentence what you were saying.
Okay. So I was actually just reading my Osman's question. Um, so like
Do you want to see there
well,
on front? Which question you were addressing? We'll just bring May to for you to have a look at her.
oh, I see. Yeah, I guess that's good. I like this isn't like a radio show, right? So we can actually see. Hello. Thank you for your questions. Um, wow, this feels like a therapy session. Uh, I don't know who's the patient though. So yeah, so like I think I was just saying that I actually think Plato agrees with the poet like 99.9% of the time. Uh, what I mean is that uh, if you get like a good poet who understands human nature and the human condition, he or she will tell a pretty compelling story that once you read about it or see it, you will be like, this is exactly how human beings are. Um, and Plato does think that poetry, has that power to reveal the truth about human beings. Um,
Okay, I think we're back.
okay, back again. Plato also has a very like uneasy attitude towards technology. Anyway, uh, But Plato would add that poets are not 100% right. They're not 100% right. There's this like very small number of cases. This kind of like
Perfect. Okay.
okay. So although like this question took two technological interruptions, I haven't forgot my thread. Um, so I actually think Plato would argue that the poets are wrong when it comes to like a kind of 0.01% of human beings. The human beings that Plato labels philosophers. So almost all human beings are like they are prone to be disturbed and unsettled. And poetry has a wonderful time dealing with people like this. But they're not aware or like they cannot portray the philosopher's response to things. Mainly because the philosophers aren't disturbed or aren't unsettled. Another way to make this point is to say that, like, uh, Plato thinks deep down, almost all human beings have a kind of inborn desire to be greedy, to be tyrannical, to want to control others. And poetry really capitalizes on this. A lot of the engaging poetry is about these different manifestations and varieties of greed or greediness or wanting more, uh, uh, pursuing power as we understand it. Uh, but he also thinks there are this like very small group of people who are not attracted by these things. They're not attracted by power. They don't have greed for the things that people usually strive for: money, reputation, honor, and stuff. They want something else. They have a very different value system, such that the things that usually disturb human beings don't disturb these people. These are the people like Socrates, philosophers. And because poetry can't uh, portray these people, you might say it's missing out on the complete picture of humanity. Poetry gets 99.9% of the things right. But they're just like, there are these small exceptions, these weird counterexamples. And somehow, like Plato's dialogues or his works set out to accomplish that. The things that poetry can't do, I'm going to use my dialogues to accomplish. And this is, I think, I wonder if that's like a satisfying answer, but that's the best I can think of right now. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Um, do you have anything to add, or should I move to the next question?
No, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay. The next one is Sarah Ernagar.
Oh, she couldn't make it. She will be watching the recording tomorrow.
Actually, I didn't totally get her question. I wanted to like ask her what she meant.
We'll find out tomorrow what she meant.
Yeah. If I can't finish all these questions, I wouldn't mind finding some time to produce a kind of written response.
Wonderful. We'll let her know.
So maybe we can like continue the conversation in like uninterrupted electronic emails. The next one is Radwa Shadid.
Oh, she's also a morning bird. She couldn't make it.
Oh, I see.
But if you have something to say, she will still be watching the recording tomorrow.
Yeah, I'll read her question actually. She said, based on the paper, could we consider the quarrel between philosophy and poet mainly because philosophy is a human mental product, while poet is a human emotional product? Or is this an oversimplification of the quarrel? Um, if I wanted to summarize my own paper, Plato's view is definitely complicated, but paper is always simplified. Uh, I would actually say the quarrel between philosophy and poetry is indeed, or I would say it's about the role of reason or the role of rationality in life. Uh, Plato ends up endorsing reason. He thinks reason, rationality, knowledge should be our ultimate guide. Like we should follow reason and take it as our mentor or our ruler. Uh, and this has a lot to do with his understanding that reason is the thing that keeps us stable, or reason is the thing that keeps us unchanging. Um, for Plato, mathematics is always very important. He will say before you study philosophy, you should study 15 to 30 years of geometry, arithmetic, and stuff. And I think there's something to that, because mathematics is just a wonderful paradigm of reason or rationality. The answers in mathematics don't change. Like, if 2 plus 2 equals 4, that's the answer you give, no matter how old you are, no matter where you are. If you're in Cairo, you're in Taiwan, you're in Boston, 2 plus 2 equals 4. So already, like in mathematics, you can see how like rationality, reason has this a feature of once you get a hold of truth, you won't have to change. You give the same answer over and over again. It's a kind of stability. It's a kind of a constancy. The poet, according to Plato, or the stories in poetry, don't value reason that highly. The way it portrays heroes in tragedy, heroes undergo a kind of suffering, and they let themselves go. They cry, or they become angry. They unleash their anger at their enemies. All this, according to Plato, is actually approving of our emotions at the expense of demoting reason. So reason takes a kind of a second or a lower place. And to endorse emotions for Plato means to endorse change and to endorse a kind of variety. The poet, at the end of the day, is a creator. Unlike the mathematician who gives the same answer, for questions, the poet, he or she always wants to do something different. Oh, today I did a story about a man. What about a woman? How would a woman react to the situation? Or how would a slave, instead of a free person, react to the situation? What if I did this? Had the same setting under a democracy instead of an oligarchy, and so on. So the poet is very creative, and he doesn't want to repeat himself. He wants to make new things. He wants to do new things, and he wants to portray the variety of human reactions to things. And in all these ways, there's a closer alliance between poetry and emotions, feelings, or desires than it is to reason. Oh. Therefore, like another way to think about this is that most philosophical works are treatises, while most poetic works are rarely like that. They're not treatise-like in their form. So I wouldn't say it's an oversimplification of the quarrel. I would just add some comments to like make the simplification even sharper. That would be my answer. The next one is from Mohammed Walid. The tech guy. Thank you for your questions. I might not read everything since you had like 3 comments. Yeah. I'll make them like
I think they
I'll give
are
like
somewhat
a
related.
yeah, I'll give it like a shortened version. I won't read
Okay.
everything. I hope that's okay.
Okay.
Um, yeah, so you said like philosophy considers life like a uniform set of rules and reasons, while poetry deals with life as experience or feelings. And then you ask, why or how does philosophy deal with life as a set of rules and reasons without any feelings that could be generalized to all humans? Um, did you mean this as a kind of like criticism of philosophy?
Maybe, or that's what I understood from the paper, or from what Plato was saying or dealing with.
Yeah.
It's somewhat, I
Um,
don't understand how that could be generalized on every human being. That those
hmm.
set of rules, and like
Oh, so
everyone
you
has.
mean like how can philosophy actually achieve that? Like reduce
Yeah.
human life to
Yes. Yes.
a set of rules of conduct.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely like a kinship between uh, understanding. Well, try to regulate our life with a limited fixed set of rules and Plato's view of philosophy of living a kind of a life of reason and pursuing knowledge. Um, there's a kinship between these two. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that Plato found those sets of rules. Like he never really gives like an actual set of rules and say you should follow them. Usually, what he gives, I would call very, very general guidelines that that accommodates or allows for different rules. Um, so I think actually in Plato's conception, uh, like all philosophers aim at a kind of constancy. They aim at not being disturbed by the changes in life. Uh, but different people have to deal with this in different ways.
Mhm.
And for example, I'm more prone to anger, so I might need to have a lot more rules, like dealing with like anger issues. And some other people, they might be more vulnerable to different emotions, like pity or sympathy, and then they need to have more rules to help them with that. So, so I would actually say like different people, even if they adopt the same ideal that Plato or Socrates is inviting us to adopt, uh, you can have the same goal, but different ways of achieving it, and then like you get different sets of rules for
Yes.
different people. Um, so I actually would say like the real issue is not whether there are sets of rules that can be generalized to humans, but whether when Plato says, "Oh, you should live a life where you're a constant and stable person," how come he thinks that is applicable to everyone? Maybe there are some people who just like change, like
Yes.
they only become happy or feel they're living a meaningful life when it's changing. Uh, Actually, in another dialogue, there's this guy called Callicles, and he's very hostile to philosophy. And he just gives this point. I thought it was very wonderful. He said, Socrates, if not being disturbed is your ideal, then you're no different from a corpse. Like
Exactly.
you're living the ideal of a corpse, like or a stone. You're a stone. You don't have any emotions or feelings. That's crazy. And I always felt like it's really wonderful of Plato to include that. Like he acknowledges that what he likes is problematic precisely by having a character in his works challenge this point. And then if you go to go to that dialogue, you see Socrates trying to answer that question. So so although I just tried to defend Plato, I would acknowledge that what you just the question you raise is actually like quite interesting. Plato's ideal is one thing, but there are definitely ways to challenge it. Oh, sorry. Is it back again? It's back again. Even though I can't hear you guys right now. The last 30 seconds. Okay. Uh, did I do this? Um, did you guys hear the Callicles bit about um, like someone in Plato's dialogue criticizes Socrates, and he says, if this is the life you want to live, like a life that's not being disturbed, that's the life no different from a corpse. Um, and I always felt like it was very wonderful of Plato to actually include that criticism in his own works. You know, he seems to acknowledge that there's something about his enemy or his opponent makes a kind of like valid point. And then if you go to that dialogue, you'll see Socrates trying to address or at least trying to respond. Whether it's successful, you know, you have to go to the dialogue to find out for yourself. But I do think uh, it, it's something that even Plato is willing to reconsider. Like, this is something that my teacher Socrates endorsed, and I find it very attractive. But I also acknowledge that there are these people who would strongly disagree with Socrates with very simple but very good opposing reasons, and we have to listen to them to figure out whether Socrates' ideals can withstand the test of time. I'll move on to your second question. Um, you kind of criticize. You say like, why do Plato or Socrates neglect the process of feeling? Why do they think it's an obstacle in human life? And then you say, for you personally, feelings made you realize a lot of truths about life and death. Um, and I absolutely agree. So like I guess Karim just told you guys. I just became a parent this summer. Um, and I'm undergoing a lot of emotional stuff that I'm aware that Plato would find very dangerous. um, but I would say, yeah, like there are lots of life experiences that you might. It's very hard to find a word for them, but they feel like they feel like a kind of wisdom that you couldn't get otherwise than by like actually feeling it, through your body or through your emotions. Um, I'm not sure. Like I know what I'm not sure. Like if Plato's answer is satisfying. Um, I can just sort of like briefly repeat the point I made in my paper. Plato finds emotions very distortive, so he thinks it fails to give us the truth. Um, so this is why I mentioned this experience. My son Remy, he was born prematurely, and he had to be in the ICU for the first month and a half, and we were living under like a lot of agony and anxiety. There's a lot of fear, and and because I study Plato, I'm aware that Plato is behind my back and criticizing my fear. Um, and one of the things he says is that uh, Plato would say, "Oh, Ikai, you're living too much in the moment. In the moment, this seems like a huge thing, and it's going to crush your life. But you should always like take a step back and realize, this is nothing. Like a lot of people are going through this thing you're going through. Like it's like your tragedy or whatever it is that's challenging. It's not special. Blah blah blah." Um, so he actually thinks like the pain or the fear or the joy we feel at the moment always tends to exaggerate things. So like if something makes me afraid, I tend to make the harm it causes much bigger than it actually is. If I look at it with reason, I realize, oh, it's only going to harm me like a little. But if I feel it with emotions, I feel, oh, this is gonna like devastate me. And the same thing happens not just with negative feelings, but with positive ones as well. So Plato seems to think that emotions do not give us access to truth or reality, at least according to this argument. I would definitely just, I might side with your challenge because I might say Plato seems right in some respects, but I don't find this answer totally like satisfying. Um, Maybe I'm a bit like influenced by moderns. There are these certain modern philosophers that actually argue that reason and emotions are almost like different organs. Just like the eyes can see color and the ears can hear sounds, reason is meant for discerning one aspect of truth, whereas emotions are for something else. They are for something else that reason just has no access to, and they have to kind of work together. I don't know what Plato would say to that. I am still thinking about it. So that's kind of like maybe dodging the question, but I really, I don't know. I'll have to think about it some more. Um, your last question. Let's see. Oh yeah, so I think the last question is kind of like you trying to like defend poetry against philosophy, right? You say uh, uh, the example of the father is just strange, right? Since uh, reason and rules don't bring his son back. Like you can't just tell the father like, "Hey, you know, this is life. It's always some people are going to lose their sons. Like you're just one of them. You're just unlucky. Just get over it. That's just like this is such a crazy thing to say, and then you make the you continue with this point and say, well, at least maybe a good poem about memories or about a father-son relationship could at least make the father see his son in it, or even a painting, or some artistic work could make him find consolation in it. And I absolutely agree. Um, the funny thing is how you might say Plato is a very masculine philosopher at this point. It's very strange because he seems to think that not only is feelings bad, but even consolation for those feelings are bad. And he thinks consolation for those feelings are bad because he seems to think consolation always carries a kind of endorsement. Like, if I'm consoling you and trying to make you like sorrow less, I'm kind of acknowledging the legitimacy of feeling sorrow in the first place. And he thinks that's very bad because if I once like I implicitly think, oh, it's right to feel sad over this, I'm kind of like endorsing emotions. I'm endorsing a falsified view of the world, and therefore, you're going to make this virtuous father even weaker or more effeminate, you might say. And this is where, like, like Plato seems to have a very, very skewed, like, masculine, like, understanding of what it is to be a good human being. It could be just, ancient Greece was a very, I don't know, like a very warrior kind of culture. They had to fight all the time. That causes this. But I would say that um, it is a very Platonic viewpoint, and it reflects something. I would say maybe not you guys. At least it's a bit alien. Uh, you might say to my worldview. Like I do you know I did give you Plato's answer, but I think I kind of agree with you. I think it's very harsh and severe. It's a very very uncompromising view of how one should live. Um, and maybe we shouldn't adopt it. I find it kind of crazy. Um, so sometimes I feel like if we really follow Plato's view to the end, the philosopher is really a sociopath. Um, okay, so that's all I have to say. Thank you for your questions. Um, there's a one last person, Salma Mohammed. Uh, I I actually can't hear you guys now, so I don't know if she's here or not. Oh, hello. I'm kind of like just talking to images. Um, like in Plato's cave, at least there are shadows moving and then they make sounds. But this is like worse than the cave. I just see images moving and there are no sounds. Uh, um, because of time, I actually have to prepare my son's next bottle of milk. But um, I kind of want to like deal with uh, like your questions. You pose three questions. I hope it's okay if I just condense it into one. Uh, um, I would say like you're exploring like the same thing in different aspects. So I'll just like read some of the things that kind of jumped out when I was reading this. Um, you say, how can something inherently limited and bound, such as poetry, be capable of expressing something as absolute, free, and hard to capture, such as the truth? Um, In the attempt of composing poems that are pleasant to the ear, close to the heart, and arousing to the mind, the poets would be doing the exact opposite of what a philosopher or reformer who is trying to spark, enlighten, and provoke the minds of others is trying to do. That's a very beautiful sentence. In this regard, poetry seems to play the role of an intoxicant whose purpose is to help its consumer flee the existing world to another, where your most valuable sense has been tampered with and is temporarily put on hold. Um, if How come something that has the effect to move us to be happy or be nostalgic, etc., have such an effect and influence on our? How can such something like this be trusted enough to lead us to the perception of truth? Shouldn't it be considered a manipulative tool instead, like the enchanting tunes of sirens, and thus cannot be trusted or deemed as a valid means of reasoning and contemplating, as our minds would shift from being in a state of alert and readiness to that of pleasure and indolence under the effect of poetry? I just want to first say that, like, you almost give a very poetic attack uh, on poetry. Um, I don't know if others there agree, but that's like my first reaction. Um, it's a what you express is actually a very very Platonic viewpoint. Um, uh, Plato certainly thinks poetry gives us a kind of escapism route. Like you talk about this consumer fleeing the existing world. Um, Plato himself is might be subject to that criticism. A lot of people say his utopia is a kind of escapism. Like, you can't realize the best city in this world. So you look at this eternal world that's never going to be realized, and you try to make yourself approximate it, and you imagine yourself living in it, and that's the way you conduct yourself when you live with others. So I would actually add to this that, like, uh, precisely the way you bring out this attack on poetry, it helps us to like do the other thing, which is to see how some of the things that Plato does is almost subject to the same criticisms. So it looks like he's attacking the enemy, but he also makes himself vulnerable at the same time. Like, hey, poetry, you are offering an escapist picture that makes people forget the harshness of reality and make them unable to face up to it. And then the poet's like, hey, you know what? Aren't your dialogues doing the same thing? You know, aren't your ideals doing the same thing? And second is this your notion of like enchanting manipulative tool. Poetry manipulates or enchants by sounds or by rhythms. I know this thing, like, I actually absolutely believe in this, that there are people who speak nonsense all the time, but their sound or their voice is just so gifted. It's just so pleasant to hear. And whatever nonsense comes out of their mouth, just like makes people like more receptive to them, or accept them more easily. So it is kind of a manipulative tool. But the same thing can be said about reason. Same thing can be said about reason. Uh, Reason is manipulative. You can even understand it in two senses. Um, One is this kind of like uh, uh, the way reason shows up as like a kind of compelling power of logic. Um, I have a friend who's a philosopher in Taiwan, and he's a logician. He specializes in like logic, and he when his son was born, uh, uh, I think like he was about like 5 to 7 years old. He started teaching him logic, and he became the most annoying kid ever. Like he would always like challenge the things you say, and reconstruct it into arguments. Um, but I think like what the kid is experiencing is not that different from the way certain people experience poetry. It seems to convey the power of words, and people want to use it to exert a kind of influence over people. Like, the power of logic, you must follow, and you can't do otherwise. So that's one thing. The other thing that poetry can argue to say that reason is no good, um, no better than poetry. It's also manipulative. Lies in the fact that reason can always argue both sides of the issue. This is a thing that always is very interesting in Greek culture. So there's a philosopher or a sophist. His name is Protagoras, and he says for every proposition, you can always argue for it, and you can always argue against it. Even this thing I just said, you can argue against it. um, and that's very troubling because it seems to say that reason has no way of finding the truth. It can only find truth and falsehood at the same time without knowing which is which, right? It can support A, it can support the opposite of A. Then it seems like it's just as distant from this absolute truth as poetry is. So, so I would just say, in response to your questions, I think you bring out very beautifully the ways we can jump to the side of poetry and defend it against Plato, and try to say like, hey, wait a minute, is this difference you're trying to make, your difference from poetry, really that clear? Maybe like the lines can be blurred precisely by the way you attack poetry. This is kind of my response. It's not really answering your question, but this is the thing I was thinking of. Yeah. So these are the questions I got from Karim. These are very wonderful. Thank you so much for letting me go through this. I still can't hear you, so maybe you have to type. Their sound went out. Thank you guys so much for listening too, and again for reading my paper. Thank you, Karim, for listing it in your flow. Bye bye. Enjoy the rest of your class. Hope to go back to Cairo soon. Everyone stay safe, friends. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.